Yes, this is a good place to put my device. Good morning for 16 more minutes. And then good afternoon. It's good to be here. I have visited a few times before. This is my first time speaking here. And I'll start with the little tiny elephant in the room. My thumb is broken. But I can still shake hands. So I will see you after the service. It's good to be here. It's a very cold day. But Tuesday, Monday, it's going to be +8. So, Alberta, what can we say? Is the presentation up and ready? Good. There we go. Thank you. So all of what Caitlin said is true, and a few other things as well. We'll talk about that today in the service, but when I teach at Birmingham University, I heard someone say, "What's anthropology?" Does anybody have a definition? I'm a teacher, so. You're studying it right now? I'm studying you. Yes, anthropologists study people. We study human variation. Why are we different? In what ways are we different? And what do those differences mean across the world as we interact with people from other cultures, other ethnicities, and so forth? So this is what I teach in the International Studies program at Birmingham University. And so when I start a semester and I start teaching my classes, I always start with, what do I click here? That worked. A map of the world. Is this middle one a laser? We'll find out. No, I don't know what that does. There we go, there's a laser. Okay, so a map of the world. I've lived in 7 countries. I was born in Canada. Anyone here from Canada? Okay, a few hands. I grew up in the United States. Anyone from the United States here? Okay, a few hands, okay. I spent a year as a student missionary in Benin, right there in West Africa. Anyone from Benin? No. How about Guinea in West Africa as well, on that side? Let's see. Maybe São Tomé and Príncipe. Any chance someone from São Tomé and Príncipe is here? No. Madagascar? No. Philippines? Aha, okay. That's kind of what I expected. Okay, so there we go. And the blue countries are the ones where I have traveled to, not having lived there, but I've traveled to those countries. You'll see one of the major omissions being South America. I plan to rectify that as soon as possible. But I've been to Latin America, just not South America. Anybody recognize this picture on the upper right, apart from my family? Anyone know where that is? That is IAS, the Adventist International Institute of Advanced Studies in Silang, Cavite, Philippines. I taught there for 3 years as the research director, so I taught research and statistics courses. And it is a very, very international school. It is a Seventh-day Adventist graduate school, so master's and doctoral level students, and it is extremely international. The student body is about 250. Remember, this is graduate level only. Then, of course, their families are with them, and then the faculty are there as well. And amongst that student body and the faculty, there were 84 nationalities represented while I was there. I don't know what it is right now, but 84 nationalities. Now, I did some research. I grew up at Andrews University. My father was a professor there. And Andrews boasts that it's a very international school as well, which it is. And in fact, my son is currently attending there. I checked this morning. They have 90 nationalities represented, so slightly more than IAS. However, Andrews has about 3,000 students. So proportionally, IAS is extremely multicultural. It's a very multicultural school and a very international environment. Probably the most, multicultural place I've ever worked. The other thing is that in order to keep its status as an international institute, the Philippine government does not allow them to have more than 30% Filipino enrollment, which means that there is no majority culture on campus. Andrews University has a lot of nationalities, but the majority of students are probably still American, and then they have international students as well. There was no majority at IAS. There was no majority. Of course, there were some cultures that were more represented than others, but there was no home culture, a very, very international school. So whenever I talk about IAS, people say to me, "Oh, wow, it must have been a little slice of heaven on earth." To which I say, don't forget that hell will be multicultural too. Hell will be multicultural too. I encountered this in meetings and some of the interactions on campus. So I was thinking about that in the context of Alberta, in the context of our communities. Alberta is increasingly more and more multicultural. Canada as a whole is becoming more and more multicultural over time. And how do we ensure that our churches are heaven on earth and not hell on earth, especially as we become more and more multicultural? So, of course, Jesus is the one who does this, ultimately. He is the one who helps us get along, helps us, cooperate and interact well with each other. But he does that through us. And what is our role? Do we just passively wait for Jesus to transform us, to make us kinder to our neighbors, to strangers, to new people that we encounter from different parts of the world? Or are there lessons that we can apply as we navigate this complex multicultural church that God has raised up on the earth? As a side note, I will mention that God loves diversity. In anthropology, we study not just how are we different from each other, but where do those differences come from? And what's fascinating about the human beings, not just the human body, but that we are very adaptable. So the human body, first of all, is adaptable. We adapt every year here. As the seasons change, we adapt our clothing. Our blood thickens, or we sweat more or less. There's ways we can acclimatize to what's happening around us. So the human body is adaptable, but also cultural adaptation, because culture is a response to the environment that we find ourselves in. So it's not arbitrary that we wear more clothing in December than we do in June. There's a reason for it. The type of clothing that we wear, the type of food that we eat, the barley that was talked about in children's story, that is what's grown here. I love lychees. They had them in Madagascar. I find them occasionally here. They're not as good as in Madagascar, but there's a reason that we aren't eating lychees every day. And we possibly eat barley more often. So our environment influences the type of foods we eat. It influences the type of clothes we wear. It influences other types of cultural variations. And this is how God made us, the ability to adapt to the environment that we live in so that we can survive, we can get along, and so forth. But these differences then get taught to our children, and they teach it to their children. And what happens when we move to another environment with different food, different clothing, different language, and these kinds of things? So, but it's okay for us to be different. God made us that way. He made us that we can adapt and we can change. And today's story, it's a little bit of an unlikely story, maybe I should say unexpected story for this topic, but there are some important lessons. And I say it's unexpected because I've heard sermons on Ruth before, but a lot of them focus on the part where Boaz is the kinsman redeemer or the guardian redeemer. And I want to focus more on the international moves and the international environment that took place in, this story took place in. So we're going to trace the rough outlines of the story, and then we're going to start drawing some principles that are applicable to a multicultural church. So, second map in 10 minutes. I love maps. This is the Middle East. You can see this is from a long time ago. It's the boundary lines have changed a lot. But if you go back far enough, you see here. Where's my laser pointer? Okay, there we go. You see the Mediterranean Sea. So this is the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea. Europe is up here on the ceiling. Africa is down here amongst this nice wood paneling. Egypt is here and so forth. The Arabian Peninsula is down there in the Christmas tree, if you're looking on this side. And you see there the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. Originally, they were together, but there were some bad kings that came along and they split. But this is the promised land. This is Canaan, okay? And if we go back far enough in history, we see here also the kingdom of Moab and the kingdom of Ammon. Now, who is Moab and Ammon? Well, Ammon, by the way, is the capital of Jordan today. Amman. It's the same root. It's the same word. So you see Rabbath Ammon there, that city. That is Amman, Jordan. You see the Dead Sea here, the Sea of Galilee, and the Jordan River flows between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. And so if you go back far enough, actually, to the story of Abraham and Lot, you recall that Lot was Abraham's nephew, I believe. And they were living in an area, and their flocks and their herds were getting so big, and they were kind of bumping up against each other, and they were competing for the same grazing rights. And finally they said, hey, let's part ways. You know, we're getting kind of crowded here. And Abraham said to Lot, you pick first. Where do you want to go? And Lot picked an area that he wanted to settle, and Abraham went to another place, and then they weren't bumping into each other, and they weren't competing for the same grazing grounds. We know Abraham's story. He was promised a child. The child wasn't coming. The child wasn't coming. The child wasn't coming. He and Sarah were getting old. They took matters in their own hands, and Sarah's servant girl, Hagar, got pregnant and had Ishmael. And God said, that is not the promised child through whom I'm going to raise up a nation. Eventually, Sarah herself became pregnant and had a son, and that is the history of the Israelite nation. But Lot also, we remember the story of Lot in Sodom, Sodom and Gomorrah, in the valley where Lot had settled. Lot had a wife and 2 daughters. And when Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, Lot and his wife and daughters fled into the mountains to get away from the fire, and Lot's wife turned around to watch the destruction and turn into a pillar of salt. So Lot was left with 2 daughters and no wife anymore. And for a while they lived in caves and they were hiding, and they had a traumatic experience. And Lot's daughters said, I don't see a whole lot of husbands around here. It's, what are we just doing here hanging out in a cave? We don't have husbands. We're not going to have kids. Our life is passing away. What's happening? So to keep this G-rated, basically, Lot's daughters eventually fell pregnant as well. You can figure that out. And one of them had a son named Moab, and the other one had a son named, I think, Ben-Ami, from which we get the word Ammon. And if you lived long enough ago, when there were a few people on the earth, every son got a tribe named after him. Imagine if today, like my children were called Adamites. We can't keep doing this because there's so many people, but the Moabites were descendants of Moab. The Ammonites, descendants of Ben-Ami. And so we know the history of Abraham and his descendants, the Israelites, who went into captivity down into the wood paneling of Egypt, where they spent several hundred years as slaves. Moab and Ammon didn't go back. They stayed here because they were not Israelites. And so in the meantime, also, while the Israelites were gone from Canaan, you also see here Philistines, and I don't know if you can read there, Gaza, the Gaza Strip. Philistines is another word also for Palestinians. That's modern-day Palestinians are descendants of the Philistines. And so when Israel came back from Egypt, they could have gone straight in. Of course, we know they wandered around in the desert for a long time because of, unfaithfulness and so forth. But they entered the promised land through the east side. Instead of just going straight up, they came along the east side and crossed the Jordan River. There's Jericho, and they conquered the land right there. So, this is how we get Moabites and Ammonites, who are technically distantly related to the Israelites, but it's been hundreds of years now. The Israelites have been gone. And over this time, the Israelites have adopted some Egyptian cultural traits, probably. They've adopted some practices quite different from, when you live close to people, you kind of rub off on each other. As I tell my students, culturally, you would expect someone who's born and raised in Ponoka to be more similar to someone born and raised in Lacombe than someone born and raised in Johannesburg. Just the physical distance means that if you live close to each other, you probably speak the same language, have similar experiences. You know what an Alberta winter is like. You've eaten barley. All of these kinds of things. The farther apart you are in distance, the less similar you are culturally. And so after these hundreds of years apart, far away, Moab had a very different culture from Israel. And the Israelites, as they settled the promised land, they knew of the kingdoms nearby. They clashed at times. Sometimes they had friend relations. Sometimes they, fought. But these were different kingdoms, different cultures, different ways of life. And so now we pick up our story. And how did Naomi and her family end up in Moab? So Naomi and her family were Israelites. And the Bible tells us here, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, in Israel. There was a famine. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Kilion, I'll guess. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Okay, so here we have telling us how they ended up there. They were migrants seeking a better life. Where they were living, times had gotten hard. And in fact, the word Bethlehem, if you look at the etymology or what it means house of bread. So it's a grain-producing region. They are used to growing grain, barley, among other things there. It's kind of like central Alberta, I suppose, in that regard. Probably not in terms of the weather, but so it's a grain-producing region. They're used to eating a lot of grain, and when a famine comes, you can't grow your crops, and people were going hungry, so they moved in search of something better. And I want to mention Bethlehem again because it's a tiny town. I mean, even today, it's got about 27,000 inhabitants. Maybe, it's not that big. Perhaps about like Okotoks or something. I actually looked up some comparisons. In Jesus' time, which was much later, of course, than this story, but it's a good reference point. In Jesus' time, the estimates range from 300 to 3,000 people. That's not very big. I was looking for parallels in Alberta for us to understand. Coutts, the border crossing, is about 300 people. Now, we've heard of it because it's a border crossing, and many of us who have driven down to Montana have gone through there, and also it's been in the news recently. So we've heard of it, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not a very big or important town. Even if we go to the upper number, 3,000, that's about the population of Three Hills. Anybody been to Three Hills? I've passed the exit. Okay, one person. I've passed the exit on the highway. I'm like, oh, there's Three Hills. But I've not gone through it. In the grand scheme of things, it's not a big mover and shaker in Alberta. So Bethlehem is this little tiny town, and we keep hearing it mentioned over and over in biblical history. Bethlehem, Bethlehem. This person came from Bethlehem. That person came from Bethlehem. Things happen in Bethlehem. And so God had his eye on this little insignificant town, and he said, I'm going to do great things. You don't have to be from a big city to be important, or you don't have to be prominent to be in God's eyes. He watches all of us. And so this little tiny town of Bethlehem, oh, little town of Bethlehem. They left that region as migrants seeking a better life. And continuing on, so there was eventually a return to Israel. If we read on, I'm going to skip a few verses here, just summarize them for you in the interest of time. Eventually the famine eased in Judah, so that's the original reason they had left. And did I go too far? Here, hold on. Oh yes, there's one more slide here. Okay, sorry. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah, not Oprah, Orpah, and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Now that's pretty destitute. We're not told at what point Elimelech died, if it was while his boys were still young or if they were grown men already. But in some societies, unmarried women are nobody. They have no value. They have no status. They're not allowed to hold office. They're not allowed to open businesses. They are nothing without their husbands. And at least in Naomi's case, she had sons, but those died as well. So even if you are a widow but you have sons, sometimes those can give you prominence in certain cultures. They can take care of you. They can get jobs. They can do things and so forth. She was destitute. She lost her husband and her sons, but they had been married before. And this is actually where we see the first cross-cultural encounter that's recorded. For sure, they had many cross-cultural experiences prior to that. When they first moved to Moab, I'm sure they had all kinds of encounters, misunderstandings, trying to understand this new culture they had moved to. But marriage is the first one as mentioned. We see 2 cross-cultural marriages happening here. Mahlon and Chilion are Israelites, and Orpah and Ruth are Moabites. And so cross-cultural marriages, it's an extra layer of challenge. Marriage can be challenging at times, but adding that cross-cultural element can make it even more challenging. Some of you who may be in cross-cultural marriages know about this. My brother has some friends at Andrews University. The husband is German and the wife is Brazilian. And when they were first married, the wife worked really hard on a special dinner. I don't know if it was like the birthday or anniversary. She labored all day making this food, and she made this fabulous meal for her husband. And she was so excited to share it with him. And when he got home at the end of the day, she served this fabulous meal, and he just sat there eating it quietly. And she was looking at him, kind of expecting, so she tried to coax something out of him. Well, how was the food? Do you like it? And he said, it's edible. And she burst into tears and ran out of the room. And he followed after. What's wrong? What's wrong? You don't like my food. And he says, in Germany, saying something is edible is high praise. So, these are the kinds of things that happen in cross-cultural marriages. You expect certain responses. You expect certain ways of interacting and reacting. And, even outside of marriage, sometimes we hold these expectations of people. We know they're not from our culture. We know they're not from the same place we are, but we still expect this is the way that you show respect to someone. This is how you're supposed to greet someone. And mentally we know that they're from a different culture, but we don't always understand that the way you show respect or the way that you greet someone differs. I like to say, well, in this case, you can see from the story I told that Germans make bad Brazilians, and Brazilians make bad Germans. But you can say that about any society. I tell my students in class as well, why are we judging someone by another culture? Why are we saying, oh, this Korean, they're a bad Peruvian? Of course they are. They're not Peruvian. They may be a very good Korean, though. Or, why is this Filipino is not a good Nigerian? Of course not. They may be a good Filipino. The Nigerian may be a good Nigerian. So this concept that I'm talking about is cultural relativism, which is where you assess or you judge another society or you hold another society to their own standards instead of your own. This is not the same as moral relativism, just to be clear, but cultural relativism is a concept that I talk about in class, which is where you suspend judgment of another society and you try to understand from within the context of their own culture, is this person being a good member of their culture? I see this as a tool that you can pick up and put down. There's times when cultural relativism is called for, there's times where it doesn't work, but it's a valuable and an important tool. Expecting from someone something that is more realistic than something that they wouldn't have had a chance to learn or expect. And we're not told how much cross-cultural conflict may have existed in these marriages here. Certainly there was some. They are interacting cross-culturally. We also don't see from this narrative if there were any children. It sounds like perhaps not. So I don't know how long they were married before before Mahlon and Chilion died, but we don't see children recorded, and we are also not told what they died from, whether they died simultaneously, if it was over time. Eventually, now we have just these three women left, Naomi and her two daughters-in-law, Naomi the Israelite, Orpah, and Ruth the Moabitess. And so, here. This is the slide that was throwing me off because I thought we had missed one. So again, as we continue, we see the famine eventually eased in Judah, and the three of them set out together to head back to Israel, or at least in Naomi's case, to head back. For Orpah and Ruth, it was to go for the first time, perhaps. Naomi urged her daughters-in-law to stay, and after some back and forth, Orpah finally returned home, but Ruth persisted. And we read here in Ruth 1, verses 15 and 16, "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn my back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." So, Naomi was likely homesick. She had been gone from Israel for a long time, and having a husband and sons who were from her same culture, she might not have felt so out of place. But with them gone, now she was just a foreigner in a foreign land. Now, she'd lived there for some time, so she knew the Moabite culture, but still she was homesick. And it's not like today where you can get on a plane and go for a visit or something. It was hard. Even that short distance from Moab to Israel was hard traveling in those times. And so she was likely homesick and felt unprotected in a foreign land with no husband or sons. She probably worried that her daughters-in-law would feel equally homesick and unprotected in Israel, which was a foreign land for them. And especially with no husbands or sons. So probably her thinking was that each could take refuge with extended relatives. It's not that she disliked them. Sometimes we read this and we say, well, why did Naomi tell them to go back? I don't think it's because she disliked her daughters-in-law. Apparently, they had a good relationship, you'll see shortly. But it was probably out of concern for them. I don't want you to be, away from your relatives, your extended relatives who can take care of you. It was a way of protecting them. And if you can think about if your entire nuclear family was wiped out, you would probably also want to go back and stay with extended relatives. If your parents are still alive, or if you have brothers or sisters, it's a comforting place to stay while you sort out what you're going to do next. And I imagine Naomi was interested in doing that. She was looking out for Orpah and Ruth also. Maybe they wanted to go and stay with their relatives. And yet Ruth persisted. And so we don't know exactly why. Apparently she loved her mother-in-law. And her mother-in-law loved her, which is not always common. But in this story, it seems to be. And also, I wonder if Ruth's parents were perhaps dead as well. So maybe she didn't have as much extended family to go and hang out with. But I also noted from here, the last sentence, "Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." So it seems that Ruth and probably Orpah were a different religion as well. If you go back and you read in the 5 books of Moses and you read the rules, that were given, especially in Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Israelites were not supposed to marry non-Israelites. They were told not to marry people from the lands around. And God didn't do this because God was racist or God was, didn't like other nationalities. It was because of their religions. He was concerned that would lead them astray. And it sounds like Ruth and probably Orpah also, who went back to her gods, were not following the same religion as Naomi. And yet, they had married Naomi's sons. And so, this is a concern of many migrants also. Will my kids be led astray in the new country or the culture that we're moving to? Will they leave my religion? And yet, in this case, it seems that Naomi's religion, and perhaps that of her sons, was strong enough to persuade Ruth to convert and to join Naomi's religion and join Naomi's God. Now, I will just take a little short detour here and talk about the challenges of a foreign move. We've already talked about one move when Naomi and her family moved to Moab, and now they're about to move back to Israel. We've moved a lot. My wife and kids can testify. In the approximately 10 years that we spent overseas, we lived in 5 or 6 different countries. Every couple of years. I was very pleased to see today that the appeal was for ADRA. I worked for ADRA for most of that time in various capacities in those countries I showed you. ADRA does good work, and I'm still involved with ADRA. I'm a professor at Berman now, but I'm on the board of ADRA Canada, and I still do research for them and contracts occasionally, do evaluations and so forth. A good organization, but we moved a lot. And the type of work that ADRA does, you might work for 2 or 3 years in one country, and then they say, hey, we need you in another country. And so we get uprooted and we go, and then we work there for 2 or 3 years, and they say, hey, we need you in another country. And you get uprooted and you go. And so, as opposed to some people who get to spend their entire overseas experience in one place, we hopped around a lot. We have too much experience with moving. But there's a lot of things that happen when you move. Here is one example. We lived in São Tomé and Príncipe, there on the west side of Africa. It's 2 islands out in the ocean, actually. You can't see the mainland from there, but beautiful, right on the equator. And we were moving to Madagascar, so basically across the continent. The shortest way that our goods could have shipped would have been just around the southern tip of South Africa, and they would have arrived in Madagascar, no problem. But instead, we filled our shipping container with our worldly possessions, and the general conference arranged for the shipping to take place, and we started tracking our container online. You can track an Amazon package. You can track a CCAN as well, if you have one. You just put the number in, and you watch where it's going. We watched it go up to Belgium. And I said, oh, that's a little out of the way, but okay. And then it disappeared. And for about a month, we couldn't find it in the tracking system. We would put it in, and the last thing it would say was Belgium. But it would say it had left Belgium on this date, and it wouldn't tell us where it had gone. And we were starting to get worried. Where is our stuff? Did it fall off a ship? Is it at the bottom of the ocean now? What happened to our stuff? Suddenly, it appeared in Singapore. Way over here. It had gone around Europe, through the Mediterranean Sea, through the Suez Canal, into the Red Sea, across the Indian Ocean, and stopped in Singapore. I don't know why. Didn't make sense to me. Eventually, 6 months later, it arrived in Madagascar. From Singapore, it finally made it to Madagascar. So, delayed goods. Now, I imagine that Ruth and Naomi were not sending a shipping container. But there are other things that happen when you move internationally that can influence, not knowing what to pack if you're going to a new place. When we moved to Madagascar, we packed tons of cashews because my wife makes really good granola. And when we arrived, we were selected, at the customs inspection area for, open your packages and show us what's inside. And they looked inside and they said, you can go. And later on, we found out that Madagascar is a major producer of cashews. And they probably thought, these people are crazy, but they're not criminals. They want to import cashews into Madagascar? Go for it. And so, you don't know what to pack. You don't know necessarily where you're going. And there weren't guides. There was no Lonely Planet or any kind of guide. When you're moving to Israel, here's what you need, And so they might not have known what to pack. You have a new language, new culture, new stores. When you move to a new place, where do I find this product or that product? It's kind of hard to know, like, where do I get this thing that I need? New friends, new climate, not knowing who you can trust. That's a big one. You don't know, is the person smiling in front of you about to rob you? Or are they genuinely helpful? Or are they about to sign you up for a scam? You don't know. And you don't know how to evaluate that in a new cultural context. So there's a lot of challenges. Obviously, Naomi and Ruth's challenges were somewhat different, but in some cases similar as well. Picking up the biblical narrative, Ruth gleans in a field. Why did I put a Canada goose there? Because geese are gleaners nowadays. Even modern farming techniques, some grain gets dropped. And I used to think that the geese would migrate according to the weather. When it got too cold, they would leave. Yes, but no. Actually, geese follow the availability of food, which of course decreases over time. But yeah, that's why you sometimes see geese and there's snow on the ground, but they're still around. You're like, aren't you guys late? They're still finding something. Because even those modern machines that harvest really well and take the grain and so on, they drop something. And so the geese, they just stick around until the field is empty, then they'll fly south and find the next field that has something left, and eventually they'll work down to where food is still actively growing. But in this time, the biblical times, gleaning was a way of picking up the extra. And of course, with the ancient harvesting methods, some grain would fall. And Leviticus actually commands farmers not to go up and pick up the scraps. Having land was a form of wealth, and not everybody had land. And so if you were poor, you didn't have land, you could go and you could pick up grain in a field, and that would be your portion. It was commanded. Boaz noticed Ruth gleaning in a field and learns of her identity, which the children's story covered very well. Ruth 2, 8 through 10, our verse for today. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" So, as soon as they arrived in Israel, Ruth is going out and looking for food, and she starts gleaning. Ruth could still work. Naomi would likely have had to beg. She was older, perhaps, retired. Maybe it would have been harder for her to glean. And without Ruth there, she would have had to beg. Ruth was caring for her mother-in-law with dignity. She was going and gathering food for both of them. So, I'm going to stop the narrative right here and start with a few lessons that we can glean. We can glean too, right? Some lessons from this story so far. We'll pick up the narrative again. But there's a few lessons that I think we can draw from the story so far that are very important for us to help create heaven on earth, make our churches heaven on earth instead of hell on earth as we get more and more multicultural. The first one is to plug foreigners into our networks. When I did my master's research in Malawi, my wife grew up in Malawi. Her parents were missionaries there. Her grandparents were missionaries there too. Her father grew up in Malawi as well in Southeast Africa. When I went to do my master's research, I hit the ground running. I had never been to Malawi before. This was back in 2003. But my father-in-law had connections. He contacted people. He said, "My son-in-law is coming to do anthropology research. Would you please provide a place for him to stay? Get him the research permits that he needs. He needs a research assistant. Could you please arrange someone so that he can hit the ground running?" And I spent 6 weeks doing my master's research, and I made so much progress because someone else plugged me into their networks. They knew the right people to ask for this, the right place to go for that, and I didn't have to figure this out all by myself. And that was so valuable. And so we have networks. Those of us who've lived here a while, we know where to get the good lychees or, the good ufa to make nsima or something, and plug people into those networks. Help them know where to go. Boaz was doing this for Ruth. She initially accidentally or coincidentally or providentially ended up in Boaz's field. But he said, "Okay, here's where you need to go. Here's what you need to do. You're part of my team now. I'll take care of you. I'll watch out for you. But then also, look out for them. Look out for their safety and protect them. Sadly, we see on the last slide that there was apparently harassment going on. These women who went and gleaned, I'll go back here, I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. Why would Boaz have needed to do that? Sadly, what we hear of today with harassment going on was still going on thousands of years ago. It's a human story. It's unfortunately what happens. And so Boaz was looking out for her safety and told his men, don't mess with her. Don't touch her. Don't harass her. We who've been here a while, we know the danger zones. We know which neighborhoods not to go into, or which people might be, dangerous to talk to, or watch out for this person, and helping them, looking out for them as they are sorting themselves out and figuring them out. And then, of course, caring for basic needs. I mean, Boaz even told her, here's where you get water. When you're thirsty, go get water here, And so basic needs, we cannot, overestimate the importance of helping people find their basic needs. When we lived in Guinea, I remember when we first moved up country to Sigiri, we had to fend for ourselves, figure out where to get food and water. Unfortunately, we didn't get as much help as I wish we had. But we were able then to do that for the next people that came and help them find where to get their basic needs cared for. So just picking up the biblical narrative again, a botched proposal, I put with a question mark. Let's read here. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." He replied, "All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good. Let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning." So, this story here, I will just briefly mention Malawi again. When I did my master's research, I was studying funeral culture and how people respond when someone dies. And there were two practices in this village in central Malawi that I noticed that are complementary. If a man dies, first of all, they have what they called property grabbing, which is that all of the possessions, all of the belongings in the household, the bed, the bicycles, the cooking pots, belong to the man, and the children belong to the woman. And so when a man dies, his relatives have the right to come and take all of the stuff, strip the house of everything, take it away, because it doesn't belong to her. And she keeps the children. But then there's the complementary practice of the leveret, or wife inheritance, which is that the dead man's brother will marry her, and she will get a new set of belongings, new cooking pots, new beds, new, everything again. And so these practices complement each other. Yes, she loses those things because they belonged to that family, but then a brother will marry her, and she will get it back. And so the leveret, this practice of a leveret, goes back thousands and thousands of years, and that's what we see happening here. I don't know if they practiced property grabbing as well, but when her husband died back in Moab, perhaps the goods were taken away, and now she was not only poor, but she was looking for perhaps a new husband who could take care of her. And so I put a question mark with a botched proposal because, actually, let me continue. On the next slide, we see that Naomi is actually helping to arrange this cross-cultural marriage as well, a second cross-cultural marriage, because now Ruth is a Moabitess and she's marrying another Israelite, but it's a different dominant culture. Now they're in Israel, and that is the surrounding culture. And Naomi gave advice to Ruth, saying, "Go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And it didn't go as planned. He said, hold on, there's somebody else who's first in line. And I wonder what caused this misunderstanding or this mistake, if you want to say it, Did Naomi not know that there was another guardian redeemer who was closer than Boaz? She'd been gone a long time. She might not have known. Perhaps Naomi didn't give Ruth enough details about what to say or do when she uncovered Boaz's feet. Maybe Ruth didn't follow Naomi's advice to the T. Maybe Naomi had forgotten her own culture after being away for so long, or Naomi's culture had changed in her absence. But it seems that there was some kind of mistake that had happened. If you go back again and look at this verse, she startled him, and he said, actually, there's someone who's first in line. So there was a bit of a misunderstanding happening here and a mistake happening. And so a few more lessons for creating a heaven on earth in our churches. Openness on Ruth's part. So this is one piece of advice we can get from the story for the immigrants themselves, okay? For the people who are new in a new culture. Remain open to new experiences. This was very foreign to her, going and proposing marriage this way or requesting help this way. But she said, okay, I'll do it. I'll try to fit in. I'll try to, go along with it. But then we also see kindness and affirmation on Boaz's part. One of the verses I didn't put up there, he says, after this encounter where they had this discussion and so on, he also said, bring me the shawl you are wearing and hold it out. When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. So he gave her food to go home with after that night. And he also took her seriously and affirmed her. So he says, I know who you are. People in this town know who you are. We know you're a good person. And that is so valuable to have someone affirm you and to tell you, it's okay. You might have done this, you might have made a mistake, you might have done this wrong, but you're a good person. We know this about you. Speaking truth and speaking, acknowledging someone's reality is so powerful. And that's something else that we can do is kindness and affirmation. And then he doesn't shame her to others. He didn't go to the village elders and say, you're not going to believe what she did last night. She tried following our culture and she did it wrong. He didn't go and do that. He went and he talked to the village elders. He talked to the person who was next in line and said, would you like to redeem her? If not, I will. And so on and so forth. In fact, it even says, if you read Ruth 3:14, so she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, no one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor. So he was protecting her identity also, and he was protecting her reputation. He was saying, you need to go home while it's still dark, and then he sent her back with the grain. So he wasn't gossiping about her. He wasn't exposing her. He was being careful and kind. And so this is kind of where I will end the story. I know there's a few more verses we can talk about, but in the epilogue, I will say one more thing, which is that they definitely had kids because Ruth is listed as an ancestor of Jesus. And so we know that there were children that were born to this cross-cultural marriage in this foreign land for Ruth. And you know that saying, it takes a village to raise a child. Kids grow up differently in cross-cultural environments. Naomi's sons growing up in Moab had different influences. Ruth's children now growing up in Israel or Judah. And it's helpful for us to understand what immigrant parents and children are going through and to help them become the best version of this new culture. My children, even though they have U.S. and Canadian citizenship, just like I do, they had spent their first half of their childhood overseas. We had visited North America to come visit our family, but they had not lived here. And so culturally, they were not Canadian when we moved here in 2015. They've become so, more so now, but they didn't know the right things to do or say. In fact, my son even told me, I asked him if I could tell this morning, this afternoon. I asked him if I could, and he said, yeah, no problem. He said a few years ago, he told me, when the first year we moved here, I really wanted to fit in really badly. I looked like the other Canadian kids, but culturally I wasn't. And I didn't know the right things to say. I didn't know the right things to do. And so I just watched my classmates really carefully and I copied everything. And he says, years later, I realized that wasn't essential Canadian. That was that person's personality. Or that was that person's, characteristics or quirks. But at first, he was trying to copy everything. And children want to fit in, They really want to fit in. It's important to them. And if they follow the wrong examples, they can turn out really badly. If they follow the right examples, they can turn out really good. And so it's our responsibility also then to be the village that raises these children. Many people, immigrants, they've left. They don't have their culture around them anymore. But we can, as a church, help these children grow up in the right paths, to grow up in the best version of this new culture that they are immersed in now, instead of the worst version. So we need to be the village that raises these children, that helps them, and so forth. So just in summary here, the 7 lessons, and this was coincidence, I know 7's a holy number, but plug foreigners into our networks. Look out for their safety, care for their basic needs. And as far as immigrants are concerned, the one piece of advice for you, remain open to new experiences. But we can also be kind and affirming, don't ridicule mistakes, and be the village for the children that they need so they can grow up well. This is how we can cooperate with God to make our multicultural church a heaven on earth instead of a hell on earth.